It was 11 o'clock at night, and young Marriott was locked into his room, cramming as hard as he could cram. He was a fourth-year man at Edinburgh University, and he had been plowed for this particular examination so often that his parents had positively declared they could no longer supply the funds to keep him there. His rooms were cheap and dingy, but it was the lecture fees that took the money. So Marriott pulled himself together at last and definitely made up his mind that he would pass or die in the attempt. And for some weeks now he had been reading as hard as mortal man can read. He was trying to make up for lost time and money in a way that showed conclusively he did not understand the value of either. For no ordinary man, and Marriott was in every sense an ordinary man, can afford to drive the mind as he had lately been driving his, without sooner or later paying the cost. Among the students he had few friends or acquaintances, and these few had promised not to disturb him at night, knowing he was at last reading in earnest. It was, therefore, with feelings a good deal stronger than mere surprise, that he heard his doorbell ring on this particular night, and realized that he was to have a visitor. Some men would simply have muffled the bell and gone on quietly with their work, but Marriott was not this sort. He was nervous. It would have bothered and pecked at his mind all night long not to know who the visitor was and what he wanted. The only thing to do, therefore, was to let him in, and out again, as quickly as possible. The landlady went to bed at 10 o'clock punctually, after which hour nothing would induce her to pretend she heard the bell. So Marriott jumped up from his books with an exclamation that augured ill for the reception of his caller, and prepared to let him in with his own hand. The streets of Edinburgh town were very still at this late hour. It was late for Edinburgh. And in the quiet neighborhood of F Street, where Marriott lived on the third floor, scarcely a sound broke the silence. As he crossed the floor, the bell rang a second time, with unnecessary clamor, and he unlocked the door and passed into the little hallway with considerable wrath and annoyance in his heart at the insolence of the double interruption. The fellows all know I'm reading for this exam. Why in the world did they come to bother me at such an unearthly hour? The inhabitants of the building, with himself, were medical students, general students, poor writers to the signet, and some others whose vocations were perhaps not so obvious. The stone staircase, dimly lighted at each floor by a gas jet that would not turn above a certain height, wound down to the level of the street with no pretense at carpet or railing. At some levels it was cleaner than at others. It depended on the landlady of the particular level. The acoustic properties of a spiral staircase seemed to be peculiar. Marriott, standing by the open door, book in hand, thought every moment the owner of the footsteps would come into view. The sound of the boots was so close and so loud that they seemed to travel disproportionately in advance of their cause. Wondering who it could be, he stood ready with all manner of sharp greetings for the man who dared thus to disturb his work. But the man did not appear. The step sounded almost under his nose, yet no one was visible. A sudden queer sensation of fear passed over him, a faintness and a shiver down the back. It went, however, almost as soon as it came, and he was just debating whether he would call aloud to his invisible visitor, or slam the door and return to his books, when the cause of the disturbance turned the corner very slowly and came into view. It was a stranger. He saw a youngish man, short of figure and very broad. His face was the color of a piece of chalk, and the eyes, which were very bright, had heavy lines underneath them. Though the cheeks and chin were unshaven and the general appearance unkempt, the man was evidently a gentleman, for he was well dressed and bore himself with a certain air. But strangest of all, he wore no hat, and carried none in his hand, and although rain had been falling steadily all the evening, he appeared to have neither overcoat nor umbrella. 100 questions sprang up in Marriott's mind and rushed to his lips, chief among which was something like, "Who in the world are you?" and "What in the name of heaven do you come to me for?" But none of these questions found time to express themselves in words, for almost at once the caller turned his head a little so that the gaslight in the hall fell upon his features from a new angle. Then in a flash Marriott recognized him. "Field, man alive, is it you?" he gasped. The fourth-year man was not lacking in intuition, and he perceived at once that here was a case for delicate treatment. He divined, without any actual process of thought, that the catastrophe often predicted had come at last, and that this man's father had turned him out of the house. They had been at a private school together years before, and though they had hardly met once since, the news had not failed to reach him from time to time with considerable detail, for the family lived near his own, and between certain of the sisters there was a great intimacy. Young Field had gone wild later. He remembered hearing about it all. Drink, a woman, opium, or something of the sort. He could not exactly call to mind. "Come in," he said at once, his anger vanishing. "There's been something wrong, I can see. Come in and tell me all about it, and perhaps I can help." He hardly knew what to say, and stammered a lot more besides. The dark side of life and the horror of it belonged to a world that lay remote from his own select little atmosphere of books and dreamings, but he had a man's heart for all that. He led the way across the hall, shutting the front door carefully behind him, and noticed as he did so that the other, though thoroughly sober, was unsteady on his legs and evidently much exhausted. Marriott might not be able to pass his examinations, but he at least knew the symptoms of starvation, acute starvation, unless he was much mistaken, when they stared him in the face. "Come along," he said cheerfully, and with genuine sympathy in his voice. "I'm glad to see you. I was going to have a bite of something to eat, and you're just in time to join me." The other made no audible reply, and shuffled so feebly with his feet that Marriott took his arm by way of support. He noticed for the first time that the clothes hung on him with pitiful looseness. The broad frame was literally hardly more than a frame. He was as thin as a skeleton. But as he touched him, the sensation of faintness and dread returned. It only lasted a moment and then passed off, and he ascribed it, not unnaturally, to the distress and shock of seeing a former friend in such a pitiful plight. "Better let me guide you. It's shamefully dark, this hall. I'm always complaining," he said lightly, recognizing by the weight upon his arm that the guidance was sorely needed. But the old cat never does anything except promise. He led him to the sofa, wondering all the time where he had come from and how he had found out the address. It must be at least 7 years since those days at the private school when they used to be such close friends. "Now, if you'll forgive me for a minute," he said, "I'll get supper ready, such as it is. And don't bother to talk, just take it easy on the sofa. I see you're dead tired. You can tell me about it afterwards and we'll make plans." The other sat down on the edge of the sofa and stared in silence, while Marriott got out the brown loaf, scones, and a huge pot of marmalade that Edinburgh students always keep in their cupboards. His eyes shone with a brightness that suggested drugs, Marriott thought, stealing a glance at him from behind the cupboard door. He did not like yet to take a full square look. The fellow was in a bad way, and it would have been so like an examination to stare and wait for explanations. Besides, he was evidently almost too exhausted to speak. So, for reasons of delicacy, and for another reason as well which he could not exactly formulate to himself, he let his visitor rest apparently unnoticed while he busied himself with the supper. He lit the spirit lamp to make cocoa, and when the water was boiling he drew up the table with the good things to the sofa, so that Field need not have even the trouble of moving to a chair. "Now let's tuck in," he said, "and afterwards we'll have a pipe and a chat. I'm reading for an exam, you know, and I always have something about this time. It's jolly to have a companion." He looked up and caught his guest's eyes directed straight upon his own. An involuntary shudder ran through him from head to foot. The face opposite him was deadly white, and wore a dreadful expression of pain and mental suffering. "By gad," he said, jumping up, "I quite forgot. I've got some whiskey somewhere. What an ass I am. I never touch it myself when I'm working like this." He went to the cupboard and poured out a stiff glass, which the other swallowed at a single gulp, and without any water. Marriott watched him while he drank it, and at the same time noticed something else as well. Field's coat was all over dust, and on one shoulder was a bit of a cobweb. It was perfectly dry. Field arrived on a soaking wet night without hat, umbrella, or overcoat, and yet perfectly dry, even dusty. Therefore he had been under cover. What did it all mean? Had he been hiding in the building? It was very strange. Yet he volunteered nothing, and Marriott had pretty well made up his mind by this time that he would not ask any questions until he had eaten and slept. Food and sleep were obviously what the poor devil needed most and first. He was pleased with his powers of ready diagnosis, and it would not be fair to press him until he had recovered a bit. They ate their supper together while the host carried on a running one-sided conversation, chiefly about himself and his exams, and his old cat of a landlady, so that the guest need not utter a single word unless he really wished to, which he evidently did not. But while he toyed with his food, feeling no desire to eat, the other ate voraciously. To see a hungry man devour cold scones, stale oatcake, and brown bread laden with marmalade was a revelation to this inexperienced student, who had never known what it was to be without at least 3 meals in a day. He watched in spite of himself, wondering why the fellow did not choke in the process. But Field seemed to be as sleepy as he was hungry. More than once his head dropped, and he ceased to masticate the food in his mouth. Marriott had positively to shake him before he could go on with his meal. A stronger emotion will overcome a weaker, but this struggle between the sting of real hunger and the magical opiate of overpowering sleep was a curious sight to the student, who watched it with mingled astonishment and alarm. He had heard of the pleasure it was to feed hungry men and watch them eat, but he had never actually witnessed it, and he had no idea it was like this. Field ate like an animal, gobbled, stuffed, gorged. Marriott forgot his reading and began to feel something very much like a lump in his throat. "Afraid there's been awfully little to offer you, old man," he managed to blurt out when at length the last scone had disappeared, and the rapid, one-sided meal was at an end. Field still made no reply, for he was almost asleep in his seat. He merely looked up wearily and gratefully. "Now you must have some sleep, you know," he continued, "or you'll go to pieces. I shall be up all night reading for this blessed exam. You're more than welcome to my bed. Tomorrow we'll have a late breakfast and see what can be done, and make plans. I'm awfully good at making plans, you know," he added with an attempt at lightness. Field maintained his dead sleepy silence, but appeared to acquiesce, and the other led the way into the bedroom, apologizing as he did so to this half-starved son of a baronet, whose own home was almost a palace, for the size of the room. The weary guest, however, made no pretense of thanks or politeness. He merely steadied himself on his friend's arm as he staggered across the room, and then, with all his clothes on, dropped his exhausted body on the bed. In less than a minute, he was, to all appearances, sound asleep. For several minutes, Marriott stood in the open door and watched him, praying devoutly that he might never find himself in a like predicament, and then fell to wondering what he would do with his unbidden guest on the morrow. But he did not stop long to think, for the call of his books was imperative, and happen what might, he must see to it that he passed that examination. Having again locked the door into the hall, he sat down to his books and resumed his notes on materia medica, where he had left off when the bell rang. But it was difficult for some time to concentrate his mind on the subject. His thoughts kept wandering to the picture of that white-faced, strange-eyed fellow, starved and dirty, lying in his clothes and boots on the bed. He recalled their school days together before they had drifted apart, and how they had vowed eternal friendship, and all the rest of it. And now, what horrible straits to be in. How could any man let the love of dissipation take such hold upon him? But one of their vows together, Marriott, it seemed, had completely forgotten. Just now, at any rate, it lay too far in the background of his memory to be recalled. Through the half-open door, the bedroom led out of the sitting room and had no other door, came the sound of deep, long-drawn breathing, the regular, steady breathing of a tired man, so tired that even to listen to it made Marriott almost want to go to sleep himself. He needed it, reflected the student, and perhaps it came only just in time. Perhaps so, for outside the bitter wind from across the Forth howled cruelly and drove the rain in cold streams against the window panes and down the deserted streets. Long before Marriott settled down again properly to his reading, he heard distantly, as it were, through the sentences of the book, the heavy, deep breathing of the sleeper in the next room. A couple of hours later, when he yawned and changed his books, he still heard the breathing and went cautiously up to the door to look round. At first, the darkness of the room must have deceived him, or else his eyes were confused and dazzled by the recent glare of the reading lamp. For a minute or two, he could make out nothing at all but dark lumps of furniture, the mass of the chest of drawers by the wall, and the white patch where his bath stood in the center of the floor. Then the bed came slowly into view, and on it he saw the outline of the sleeping body gradually take shape before his eyes, growing up strangely into the darkness, till it stood out in marked relief, the long black form against the white counterpane. He could hardly help smiling. Field had not moved an inch. He watched him a moment or two, and then returned to his books. The night was full of the singing voices of the wind and rain. There was no sound of traffic, no hansoms clattered over the cobbles, and it was still too early for the milk carts. He worked on steadily and conscientiously, only stopping now and again to change a book or to sip some of the poisonous stuff that kept him awake and made his brain so active. And on these occasions, Field's breathing was always distinctly audible in the room. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the house all was stillness. The shade of the reading lamp threw all the light upon the littered table, leaving the other end of the room in comparative darkness. The bedroom door was exactly opposite him where he sat. There was nothing to disturb the worker, nothing but an occasional rush of wind against the windows, and a slight pain in his arm. This pain, however, which he was unable to account for, grew once or twice very acute. It bothered him, and he tried to remember how and when he could have bruised himself so severely, but without success. At length, the page before him turned from yellow to gray, and there were sounds of wheels in the street below. It was 4 o'clock. Marriott leaned back and yawned prodigiously. Then he drew back the curtains. The storm had subsided, and the castle rock was shrouded in mist. With another yawn, he turned away from the dreary outlook and prepared to sleep the remaining 4 hours till breakfast on the sofa. Field was still breathing heavily in the next room, and he first tiptoed across the floor to take another look at him. Peering cautiously round the half-open door, his first glance fell upon the bed, now plainly discernible in the gray light of morning. He stared hard, then he rubbed his eyes. Then he rubbed his eyes again and thrust his head farther round the edge of the door. With fixed eyes, he stared harder still, and harder. But it made no difference at all. He was staring into an empty room. The sensation of fear he had felt when Field first appeared upon the scene returned suddenly, but with much greater force. He became conscious, too, that his left arm was throbbing violently and causing him great pain. He stood wondering and staring and trying to collect his thoughts. He was trembling from head to foot. By a great effort of the will, he left the support of the door and walked forward boldly into the room. There, upon the bed, was the impress of a body where Field had lain and slept. There was the mark of the head on the pillow and the slight indentation at the foot of the bed where the boots had rested on the counterpane. And there, plainer than ever, for he was closer to it, was the breathing. Marriott tried to pull himself together. With a great effort, he found his voice and called his friend aloud by name. "Field, is that you? Where are you?" There was no reply, but the breathing continued without interruption, coming directly from the bed. His voice had such an unfamiliar sound that Marriott did not care to repeat his questions, but he went down on his knees and examined the bed above and below, pulling the mattress off finally, and taking the coverings away separately one by one. But though the sounds continued, there was no visible sign of Field, nor was there any space in which a human being, however small, could have concealed itself. He pulled the bed out from the wall, but the sound stayed where it was. It did not move with the bed. Marriott, finding self-control a little difficult in his weary condition, at once set about a thorough search of the room. He went through the cupboard, the chest of drawers, the little alcove where the clothes hung, everything. But there was no sign of anyone. The small window near the ceiling was closed, and anyhow it was not large enough to let a cat pass. The sitting room door was locked on the inside. He could not have got out that way. Curious thoughts began to trouble Marriott's mind, bringing in their train unwelcome sensations. He grew more and more excited. He searched the bed again till it resembled the scene of a pillow fight. He searched both rooms, knowing all the time it was useless, and then he searched again. A cold perspiration broke out all over his body, and the sound of heavy breathing all this time never ceased to come from the corner where Field had lain down to sleep. Then he tried something else. He pushed the bed back exactly into its original position, and himself lay down upon it just where his guest had lain. But the same instant he sprang up again in a single bound. The breathing was close beside him, almost on his cheek, and between him and the wall. Not even a child could have squeezed into the space. He went back into his sitting room, opened the windows, welcoming all the light and air possible, and tried to think the whole matter over quietly and clearly. Men who read too hard and slept too little, he knew were sometimes troubled with very vivid hallucinations. Again, he calmly reviewed every incident of the night, his accurate sensations, the vivid details, the emotions stirred in him, the dreadful feast. No single hallucination could ever combine all these and cover so long a period of time. But with less satisfaction, he thought of the recurring faintness and curious sense of horror that had once or twice come over him, and then of the violent pains in his arm. These were quite unaccountable. Moreover, now that he began to analyze and examine, there was one other thing that fell upon him like a sudden revelation. During the whole time, Field had not actually uttered a single word. Yet, as though in mockery upon his reflections, there came ever from that inner room the sound of the breathing, long-drawn, deep, and regular. The thing was incredible. It was absurd. Haunted by visions of brain fever and insanity, Marriott put on his cap and mackintosh and left the house. The morning air on Arthur's seat would blow the cobwebs from his brain, the scent of the heather, and above all, the sight of the sea. He roamed over the wet slopes above Holyrood for a couple of hours, and did not return until the exercise had shaken some of the horror out of his bones, and given him a ravening appetite into the bargain. As he entered, he saw that there was another man in the room, standing against the window with his back to the light. He recognized his fellow student, Green, who was reading for the same examination. "Read hard all night, Marriott," he said, "and thought I'd drop in here to compare notes and have some breakfast. You're out early?" he added, by way of a question. Marriott said he had a headache and a walk had helped it, and Green nodded and said, "Ah." But when the girl had set the steaming porridge on the table and gone out again, he went on with a rather forced tone. "Didn't know you had any friends who drank, Marriott." This was obviously tentative, and Marriott replied dryly that he did not know it either. Sounds just as if some chap were sleeping it off in there, doesn't it, though? Persisted the other, with a nod in the direction of the bedroom, and looking curiously at his friend. The two men stared steadily at each other for several seconds, and then Marriott said earnestly, "Then you hear it too, thank God." "Of course I hear it. The door's open. Sorry if I wasn't meant to." "Oh, I don't mean that," said Marriott, lowering his voice, "but I'm awfully relieved. Let me explain. Of course, if you hear it too, then it's all right. But really, it frightened me more than I can tell you. I thought I was going to have brain fever or something. And you know what? A lot depends on this exam. It always begins with sounds or visions or some sort of beastly hallucination, and I—" "Rot," ejaculated the other impatiently. "What are you talking about?" "Now listen to me, Green," said Marriott as calmly as he could, for the breathing was still plainly audible. "And I'll tell you what I mean, only don't interrupt." And thereupon he related exactly what had happened during the night, telling everything, even down to the pain in his arm. When it was over, he got up from the table and crossed the room. "You hear the breathing now plainly, don't you?" he said. Green said he did. "Well, come with me and we'll search the room together." The other, however, did not move from his chair. "I've been in already," he said sheepishly. "I heard the sounds and thought it was you. The door was ajar, so I went in." Marriott made no comment, but pushed the door open as wide as it would go. As it opened, the sound of breathing grew more and more distinct. "Someone must be in there," said Green under his breath. "Someone is in there, but where?" said Marriott. Again he urged his friend to go in with him. But Green refused point blank, said he had been in once and had searched the room and there was nothing there. He would not go in again for a good deal. They shut the door and retired into the other room to talk it all over with many pipes. Green questioned his friend very closely, but without illuminating result, since questions cannot alter facts. "The only thing that ought to have a proper, a logical explanation is the pain in my arm," said Marriott, rubbing that member with an attempt at a smile. "It hurts so infernally and aches all the way up. I can't remember bruising it, though." "Let me examine it for you," said Green. "I'm awfully good at bones, in spite of the examiner's opinion to the contrary." It was a relief to play the fool a bit, and Marriott took his coat off and rolled up his sleeve. "By George, though, I'm bleeding," he exclaimed. "Look here, what on earth's this?" On the forearm, quite close to the wrist, was a thin red line. There was a tiny drop of apparently fresh blood on it. Green came over and looked closely at it for some minutes. Then he sat back in his chair, looking curiously at his friend's face. "You've scratched yourself without knowing it," he said presently. "There's no sign of a bruise. It must be something else that made the arm ache." Marriott sat very still, staring silently at his arm, as though the solution of the whole mystery lay there, actually written upon the skin. "What's the matter? I see nothing very strange about a scratch," said Green, in an unconvincing sort of voice. "It was your cufflinks, probably, last night in your excitement." But Marriott, white to the very lips, was trying to speak. The sweat stood in great beads on his forehead. At last he leaned forward close to his friend's face. "Look," he said, in a low voice that shook a little. "Do you see that red mark? I mean underneath what you call the scratch." Green admitted he saw something or other, and Marriott wiped the place clean with his handkerchief and told him to look again more closely. "Yes, I see," returned the other, lifting his head after a moment's careful inspection. "It looks like an old scar." "It is an old scar," whispered Marriott, his lips trembling. "Now it all comes back to me." "All what?" Green fidgeted on his chair. He tried to laugh, but without success. His friend seemed bordering on collapse. "Hush, be quiet, and I'll tell you," he said. "Field made that scar." For a whole minute the two men looked each other full in the face without speaking. "Field made that scar," repeated Marriott at length in a louder voice. "Field? You mean last night?" "No, not last night. Years ago. At school with his knife. And I made a scar on his arm with mine." Marriott was talking rapidly now. "We exchanged drops of blood in each other's cuts. He put a drop into my arm and I put one into his." "In the name of heaven, what for?" "It was a boy's compact. We made a sacred pledge, a bargain. I remember it all perfectly now. We had been reading some dreadful book, and we swore to appear to one another. I mean, whoever died first swore to show himself to the other, and we sealed the compact with each other's blood. I remember it all so well, the hot summer afternoon in the playground 7 years ago, and one of the masters caught us and confiscated the knives, and I've never thought of it again to this day." "And you mean," stammered Green. But Marriott made no answer. He got up and crossed the room and lay down wearily upon the sofa, hiding his face in his hands. Green himself was a bit nonplussed. He left his friend alone for a little while, thinking it all over again. Suddenly an idea seemed to strike him. He went over to where Marriott still lay motionless on the sofa and roused him. In any case, it was better to face the matter, whether there was an explanation or not. Giving in was always the silly exit. "I say, Marriott," he began as the other turned his white face up to him, "there's no good being so upset about it. I mean, if it's all a hallucination, we know what to do, and if it isn't, well, we know what to think, don't we?" "I suppose so, but it frightens me horribly for some reason," returned his friend in a hushed voice. "And that poor devil. But after all, if the worst is true, and that chap has kept his promise, well, he has, that's all, isn't it?" Marriott nodded. "There's only one thing that occurs to me," Green went on, "and that is, are you quite sure that he really ate like that? I mean, that he actually ate anything at all?" he finished, blurting out all his thought. Marriott stared at him for a moment, and then said he could easily make certain. He spoke quietly. After the main shock, no lesser surprise could affect him. "I put the things away myself," he said, after we had finished. "They're on the third shelf in that cupboard. No one's touched them since." He pointed without getting up, and Green took the hint and went over to look. "Exactly," he said after a brief examination, "just as I thought. It was partly hallucination at any rate. The things haven't been touched. Come and see for yourself." Together they examined the shelf. There was the brown loaf, the plate of stale scones, the oatcake, all untouched. Even the glass of whiskey Marriott had poured out stood there with the whiskey still in it. "You were feeding no one," said Green. "Field ate and drank nothing. He was not there at all." "But the breathing," urged the other in a low voice, staring with a dazed expression on his face. Green did not answer. He walked over to the bedroom, while Marriott followed him with his eyes. He opened the door and listened. There was no need for words. The sound of deep, regular breathing came floating through the air. There was no hallucination about that, at any rate. Marriott could hear it where he stood on the other side of the room. Green closed the door and came back. "There's only one thing to do," he declared with decision. "Write home and find out about him, and meanwhile come and finish your reading in my rooms. I've got an extra bed." "Agreed," returned the fourth-year man. "There's no hallucination about that exam. I must pass that whatever happens." And this was what they did. It was about a week later when Marriott got the answer from his sister. Part of it he read out to Green. "It is curious," she wrote, "that in your letter you should have inquired after Field. It seems a terrible thing, but you know only a short while ago Sir John's patience became exhausted, and he turned him out of the house, they say without a penny. Well, what do you think? He has killed himself. At least it looks like suicide. Instead of leaving the house, he went down into the cellar and simply starved himself to death. They're trying to suppress it, of course, but I heard it all from my maid, who got it from their footman. They found the body on the 14th, and the doctor said he had died about 12 hours before. He was dreadfully thin." "Then he died on the 13th, said Green. Marriott nodded. "That's the very night he came to see you." Marriott nodded again. A volley of illumination, blue, red, assaulted Ben's closed eyelids as he woke. He groaned and turned over in his bed, only to be met with a more intense pulse from the other side. He opened his eyes. The entire ceiling was a carnival of gaily rotating lights, crashing in through the room's one small window. He sat up. Police cars. The floor was cold against his bare feet as he padded to the window. He couldn't see the cars from here, but the lights were near blinding. Pulling on a pair of jeans, he crossed the room and went out into the hall. The house was deathly quiet, the particular sort of silence reserved for the night before the first early morning of a new academic year. It seemed that not everyone was taking advantage of the final summer's sleep, though. The door of the room next to his was wide open, and Ben glanced inside as he passed. What he saw was so odd that he stopped. A young man, clad only in drooping boxer shorts, stood with his back to the door. Before him was a large flat-screen television, on which the unmoving image of a smiling, red-haired woman loomed at twice life size. The young man's stance was wide, his feet planted firmly on the floor. His hands were clenched into fists by his sides. He stared at the picture on the screen, and Ben could almost feel the rage emanating from the man in sickening waves. "You filthy cunt!" the man suddenly screamed, and Ben nearly leaped out of his skin. "You slut, you whore, you cum dumpster!" Ben hurried away from the door, his heart thumping in rapid time with the blue and red lights that still throbbed across the walls. He didn't think the crazy guy had seen him, and he wasn't going to call out to him to ask what the hell that had been all about. Downstairs, the kitchen and living area were deserted. The flashers from outside made the ground floor look like the inside of a fish tank. Ben went to the front window and parted the blinds with his fingers. There were 2 police cars parked on the curb, facing one another. He couldn't see anyone around the cars, and couldn't make out any silhouettes inside. In fact, the entire street, comprised of nothing but late 1920s frame houses converted into student apartments, was completely desolate. Frowning, Ben turned from the window and was promptly startled by the figure of a woman leaning against the kitchen counter. He hadn't heard anyone come in. Her features were mostly shadowed, but in the glow from the flashers he could make out the lengths of straight dark hair that curtained her thin face. "I wonder what's going on out there," Ben said, trying to hide the quaver in his voice. The girl shrugged, then turned her back to him and fiddled with something on the counter. It took Ben a moment to see that she was dipping a tea bag into a mug with studied, almost robotic motions. He felt he ought to say something else, but before he could, she grabbed her teacup and wandered off toward the stairs, melting into the shadows as if she had never been there. Unsettled, Ben glanced out the window again, but the scene hadn't changed. He really ought to be getting back to bed. His first class of the semester began at 8, and his punctuality was something of a point of pride, but he wasn't sure he would be able to sleep. Every nerve in his body was tuned and vibrating against the heavy air. He wasn't even sure what time it was. At last, he accepted his wakefulness and rounded the bar into the kitchen, snagging a soda from the communal refrigerator. He could stay down here for a while, at least until he got tired. He could keep an eye on things. He popped open the can and took a long swig while standing by the sink and looking out the windows on either side of the front door. The lights still flashed, and the house remained indifferent around him. Suddenly, the doorknob turned. He hadn't seen or heard anyone approaching the house. He would have thought the door was locked at night, but it opened freely, and in tumbled a tall blond man with his well-muscled arms encircling a giggling young woman in jeans and a black blouse. Her ponytail swished as the pair collapsed onto the rug and began kissing exuberantly, not even bothering to close the door behind them. They didn't seem to notice Ben standing there, or if they did, they paid him no attention. Ben felt uncomfortable watching them, but he was afraid to move for fear they would see him. He backed discreetly into the shadows, hoping they would be finished with their business sooner rather than later. The pair seemed in no hurry. The woman, kneeling on the carpet with her back to Ben, pulled her shirt off over her head and tossed it aside. The strap of the black bra beneath made a harsh line across her flesh. Ben wanted to sink into the floor. The man crouched over her, a lascivious grin parting his wide face. She laughed, but then gasped as he grabbed her by the ankles, hard, and yanked her legs up and apart. Ben couldn't see her face, but he could sense the shift in the atmosphere, and he thought he heard her murmuring for him to stop. The man did not stop. Even from his vantage point, Ben could see the man's powerful hands closing tighter and tighter around her ankles, and for one absurd moment, Ben thought to himself that he was surely going to pull the poor woman's feet off. It occurred to him that he should call out or try to stop him somehow, but he was frozen in place, staring at the surreal scene in horrified shock. And then, unbelievably, the woman's feet indeed separated from her ankles. There was no sound and no blood that he could see. The girl didn't even scream. But Ben clearly heard the sickening thump as the feet hit the carpet and just lay there, incongruous and cleanly removed, like latex Halloween props. The soda can was clutched so hard in Ben's hand that the aluminum was buckling, but he barely noticed. He was still standing there in complete disbelief when the man's head jerked up. Huge ice-blue eyes stared right into his, and Ben felt his bladder let go. The man leaped to his feet, leaving the girl to slump over into apparent unconsciousness. He approached the bar behind which Ben stood, and his arm shot out with impossible speed, his hand closing around Ben's wrist. Ben stared stupidly down at the man's manacled grip, and then the man began to pull. Ben kicked out blindly, though he was sure the kicks didn't connect because of the bar separating them. The tendons in his forearm were beginning to creak. In a moment of panic, he slammed the half-empty can against the man's arm, but of course it crumpled uselessly and dropped to the ground. Ben tried to yell, but his throat was closed so tightly that barely any air escaped, and then he began to thrash his body back and forth as violently as he could. The man's face dominated his entire field of view, those eyes boring into his, that high forehead with the swept-back hair, that wide, toothy rictus of a grin. Ben had ample time for the contours of that face to burn themselves into his memory, and then he awoke, thrashing and sweaty, in his own bed, in his own room upstairs. It was still full dark outside the window, and no police lights danced across the ceiling. The house was as silent as a tomb. Ben pulled the covers up to his chin and lay completely still until the sun came up. After downing 2 cans of Red Bull, Ben was just able to gather his things together and step out into the crisp September morning. His eyes were so dry that it hurt to blink. The campus was swarmed with people, most of them looking painfully young and lost, as Ben supposed he did. He jostled his way through the throngs and the noise, keeping his head down, not meeting anyone's gaze. He had nearly reached his destination when a piece of paper was thrust beneath his nose. "Sign the petition," a girl's voice screeched in his ear. "Justice for Janice." Ben cringed and looked up. The girl who had spoken was a stranger to him, an elfin creature with large black eyes that blinked intensely at him from behind square glasses. She was holding a sign made from pink poster board that read "Justice for Janice" in thick black marker. There was an 8x10 photo pasted beneath the phrase, and Ben stopped dead when he saw it. The woman in the picture was red-haired and smiling. She was also the same woman who had appeared in his dream, on the television screen in the room next door to his. "Who?" Ben began, but a laughing group of students heaved beside him, and their boisterous movement carried him past the girl with the petition. When he glanced back over his shoulder, only the corner of the sign was still visible, and the bespectacled girl had turned away from him. He rounded his shoulders and pushed his way toward the doors of the English department. His first class was on the 2nd floor, and he made his way quickly up the stairs, feeling the caffeine thrumming unpleasantly through his bloodstream. The classroom was half full as he entered it, and no one turned to look as he slipped through the door and took a seat near the back of the room. For that, he was grateful. He pulled out his phone and began poring through the online syllabus again, committing it to memory. Another group of students piled in moments later, and Ben barely registered their entry. There was a thumping noise nearby, and he briefly glanced from his phone to see the bottom of a crutch, and next to that a foot in a bright white cast. He looked up and saw a girl dressed in a black blouse and jeans, placing her purse on the desk directly in front of his. A ponytail snaked down her back. Ben clutched the sides of his phone so hard his knuckles went white. He hadn't seen the girl's face, but the clothes and hair were the same. The way she moved was the same. He had a brief flash of her slumping onto the carpet in the front room of his apartment building, of her cleanly severed feet. His eyes roved helplessly down to the cast on her right foot. He was still dreaming. That was the only explanation. For a moment, he considered tapping the girl on the shoulder to tell her something, but just then the professor strode into the room and everyone fell quiet. Ben couldn't tear his gaze from the girl. He felt sick and unreal, and as the professor began talking, he had to fight back the urge to vomit. He didn't hear a single word the man said. It seemed only minutes had passed before the class was over, and there was a general shuffling as everyone gathered their things. The girl slid out of her seat, balancing on her good leg while draping her purse over one arm. Ben felt a stab of panic, wondering whether he should say anything to her, and then wondering what exactly he could say without sounding completely insane. She was preparing to leave, and he thought he had decided to let it go, but then he heard his own voice, seemingly coming from a long way away. "Do you need any help with your stuff?" The girl turned toward him, and even though he knew she was the same girl as his dream, he was still surprised to see her familiar face. She considered him somewhat coolly, but without malice. "I'm all right, thanks." "What happened?" He was shocked that he had spoken again. It wasn't in his nature at all. She sighed almost imperceptibly, annoyed but trying not to show it. "Just a dumb accident. See ya." Ben stood quickly, almost knocking his desk over. He thought he saw a scowl curl the corner of the girl's mouth. "Wait a second, I know this might sound weird, but I really have to go," she said, savagely cramming the padded end of the crutch into her armpit and maneuvering into the aisle. "I think you might be in danger," Ben called, but she was already thumping away, pointedly not looking back at him, obviously wishing she could move faster. Ben considered following, but thought better of it. She wouldn't believe him if he told her. He would just be some nerdy creep trailing after her with the world's most bizarre pickup line. He collapsed back into his chair, rubbing his exhausted eyes with his hands. The rest of his classes passed in a haze. Ben heard nothing, retained nothing, and simply took up space to no effect. He didn't see the girl in the cast again. After his final class of the day, he dragged himself out into the afternoon. The sky had gone ominously gray, and the crowds had significantly thinned. He saw the woman with the sign again, and now there were others with her, all holding variations of the same sign, with the same photo of the red-haired girl. A small knot of people had gathered around them, and the woman in the glasses was speaking animatedly, but Ben couldn't hear what she was saying. The front room of his apartment building was empty. He carried his things up the stairs to his room. He had never felt so tired in his entire life, and his stomach was rumbling painfully. All he wanted was a sandwich and a long, dreamless sleep. He reached the door of his room and placed his hand on the knob. The door beside his opened, and a young man popped his head out. "Hey, my TV didn't keep you up last night, did it? Sorry, I fell asleep with it on." Ben slowly registered the man's smiling face. He was wearing a red t-shirt and jeans, and Ben idly wondered if he was wearing those drooping boxer shorts underneath them. "No, I didn't hear anything." "Oh good, I'll try not to do it again, seriously. I'm Jake, by the way." "Ben. Cool. Well, I'll let you go, I've got some shit to do. You look fucking beat." "Yeah, first day and all." Ben could barely get the words out, his thoughts filled with Jake's voice. "You filthy cunt, you whore." He hurried into his room and closed the door, turning the lock. He tossed his bag onto his desk and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was tempted to simply lie back and sleep, food be damned, but he hadn't eaten in more than 24 hours and was beginning to feel dizzy. He heaved himself to his feet and made his way downstairs. He heard laughter before he rounded the corner to the front room and sighed inwardly. He'd been hoping to simply get some food and scurry back to his room without having to have any uncomfortable interaction with anyone, especially in the state of mind he was in. The girl was sitting on the couch and her back was to him. He couldn't be sure, but he thought it was the same woman who had been standing in the kitchen in his dream, the one who had made tea and brushed him off when he came downstairs to investigate the police lights. It was her laughter he had heard. There was a young man with her, facing toward the kitchen as Ben entered. For what seemed like the 100th time that day, Ben stopped short and stared. It was the man, the one who had torn off the girl's feet. He looked slightly less sinister in person, but not by much. His hair was swept back, and his forehead glared a little in the afternoon light from the front windows. His eyes were large and blue, cold. He didn't seem to have noticed Ben. He was listening to something the girl was saying and laughing along with her. Ben considered simply turning around and going back up to his room, but then the man's gaze shifted and their eyes met. The man didn't appear to recognize Ben at all, but he did look at him oddly, as if wondering what he was doing there. His huge forehead crinkled. Ben managed to smile and continued into the kitchen, giving his hand a slight wave for good measure. The man's attention waned, and he continued talking to the girl, though they were whispering, and Ben couldn't really hear what they were saying. He slapped a sandwich together as quickly as he could, not even putting any condiments on it, just slapping some lunch meat on plain white bread and grabbing a paper towel to wrap it in before retreating to the stairs. The girl should probably be warned, he thought, but why should she listen? The girl with the cast certainly hadn't, and all this had probably just been a strange dream anyway, even though Ben knew in his bones that something else was going on, that the dream had been trying to tell him something. The man in the front room was dangerous, he had seen it. There had to be a way to warn people about him without sounding like an idiot, but as exhausted as he felt, he couldn't think of it just now. He went back to his room and locked the door. He crammed the dry sandwich into his mouth without tasting it, and lay back against the pillow without even brushing off the crumbs. He was asleep in seconds. It was full dark when he awoke to lights and noise, that blue-red pulsing from his dream, and the sound of many raised voices. His stomach clenched to think that the dream had returned, but this time he was sure he was awake, and he pinched himself on the inside of his forearm to confirm. Wincing, he rolled out of bed. There were cop cars outside, flashing their lights against his walls. The clock on his bedside table read 10:28. He opened the door a crack and peered out into the hallway, only to be confronted with a swarming throb of activity. Uniformed officers, 3 or 4 of them, mingled with a few people in campus police shirts, and a bundle of female students in yoga pants and tank tops who were craning their necks, trying to see in through the door of his immediate neighbor. Kyle, had that been his name? John? No, Jake. One of the campus officers noticed Ben peeking out, and gestured to him with a curling finger. Ben stepped out into the hall, still hanging onto the doorknob. "Have you been in your room all evening?" the officer snapped. Ben goggled at him. "Yeah, I was sleeping." "Did you hear anything strange, a fight or a struggle?" No, I was tired. I fell asleep earlier this afternoon and slept straight through. What happened? One of the real police officers stepped forward then and looked Ben up and down, taking in his weedy frame and fishy pale flesh. Did you see anyone go into this room at any point? No, just the guy who lives there. Jake, right? I saw him this afternoon. Ben described the circumstances while the officer stared at him as though he'd like to gobble him up. And there was no one else in the room with him at that time? Ben could barely meet the officer's accusing gaze. I guess there could have been. He only just leaned out the door and then went back in. I didn't see or hear anyone else, though. Stick around, all of you, the officer said, pointing around the hall to encompass all the students in the immediate vicinity. We're probably going to need to ask more questions when we get this sorted out. But what happened? The officer turned away as Ben asked, so he transferred his questioning look to the girl closest to him. She happened to be the same girl from the dream kitchen, the one who'd been talking to the foot ripper this afternoon on the couch. The blonde psychopath was nowhere to be seen, however. He's dead. What do you think happened? The girl replied. She was trying to sound bitchy and flippant, but her eyes were terrified, and her voice squeaked. He's all torn up, like in pieces, blood everywhere. How? Ben began, but whatever words he was going to say next dried up in his throat, as 3 EMTs emerged from the room next door pushing a stretcher bearing a zipped black body bag with a disturbingly lumpy contour. The copper tang of blood wafted out in a cloud behind it. Ben caught himself craning his neck to try to see into the apartment, then pulled himself back. Why in the hell would he want to see that? The police officers were still there, some of them disappearing into Jake's room, and some of the others remaining in the hallway talking to the other students. Ben watched Kitchen Girl as she headed toward the stairs, only to be intercepted by one of the officers. As soon as her back was turned toward him, Ben gestured to one of the other cops, not believing what he was about to do, not having any idea of what he was going to say, but feeling the burning need to say something. There was someone I didn't really recognize down in the lobby earlier, Ben said when he'd got the officer's attention. He kept his voice low so that Kitchen Girl would not hear him. I mean, I don't think he lives here, and I thought he looked kind of... He floundered for a moment, trying to find the words that would convey the sense of menace the man had given off in the dream. Sinister, I guess, he finished. When was this? Could you describe him? Ben recounted the man's appearance as well as he was able, carefully leaving Kitchen Girl out of the description. A part of his mind was screaming at him that he was being crazy, that this man had never done anything that would warrant an accusation of murder, but Ben quieted his doubts. If the man hadn't done anything, then the police would eventually figure that out, and if the man had done something, then Ben would have perhaps saved someone else from the killer's wrath. Besides, he wasn't coming right out and saying the guy had killed Jake, he was just describing a stranger who had been in the house. He was simply being a responsible citizen. The officer wrote down everything Ben said, then thanked him for his time and moved on to someone else. The residents of the house that had already been questioned were still gathered in a knot around the staircase, waiting to be dismissed. They were all young women, and all were wide-eyed with terror as they spoke to each other in hushed tones. Ben considered going over to talk to them, but thought better of it, and instead leaned against the stair railing with his arms crossed, trying to look casual and blameless. Then a word emerged from the women's muted conversation that made Ben's ears prick up. Janice. He knew he had recently seen or heard that name somewhere, but at the moment he couldn't put his finger on the circumstances. Then he had it. Anxiously, he approached the women. They all immediately stopped talking and stared at him as though he was a fox that had come barreling into a henhouse. "Who's Janice?" he asked. It seemed clear that none of the women wanted to answer him, and there were several seconds of awkward silence. At last, a mousy brown-haired girl tilted her head at him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ben, I live here." The girl curled her lips at him, as if considering whether this was an acceptable answer or not. Evidently, she decided it was, because she said, "I don't know much about her. It happened a long time ago." "I heard about it from my brother," one of the other women said. "He graduated back in 2006. It was big news back then." "What happened?" Ben asked. "Girl named Janice, she was a student here, lived in one of these apartment houses, may have been this one even. I don't really know. She was raped and murdered by 2 guys, other students." "Did the guys get away or something? I saw people with signs this morning." Ben helplessly pictured the sinister blonde man again, wondering if this had been what the dream was trying to tell him. The original brown-haired girl piped up again. They were caught and convicted, believe it or not. They both died in prison, though, pretty recently. I don't really remember how. I guess that's why people are bringing it up again, because the boys' parents are wigging out, wanting their names cleared, saying they were innocent and got locked up for nothing and now they're dead, blah blah. She waved a dismissive hand. Sounds to me like they did it though, so fuck those guys. The other women nodded in thoughtful agreement, and Ben withdrew from them in the face of their callous indifference. They continued talking amongst themselves after he left, as though he had never been there. Shortly afterward, the police concluded their business and trundled out of the house in one body, leaving only a garish slash of crime scene tape in their wake. There was a hubbub outside as they ran the gauntlet of the collected media representatives, but even this sound was cut off when the front door of the house was slammed shut. Ben watched as the students dispersed back to their rooms, many of them to pack their things to stay elsewhere. Ben, having nowhere else to go, simply went into his room and locked the door behind him. The house was deathly quiet as night fell outside the windows, and Ben began to question his decision to stay in the house. It seemed no one else had. He was surprised the police had let anyone stay. As he turned on the lamps to stave off the darkness, he couldn't stop thinking about the carnage that had taken place just on the other side of his bedroom wall. Nervously, he peered out the window, not mollified in the least by the sight of the empty back parking lot and a series of burned-out streetlights. After several minutes of aimless pacing, he decided he might as well go downstairs. Maybe some media people were still outside. The sight and sound of other people, even news vultures, would be comforting. He opened his door slowly, looking both ways up and down the hall before stepping out. The yellow crime scene tape across Jake's door was the only burst of color in the otherwise vast expanse of gray and black. The downstairs was in darkness also, but Ben was relieved to see that there were indeed lights and voices coming from outside. He looked through the closed blinds and saw several news vans parked on the curb, and various people milling around holding microphones and lighting equipment. He nodded to himself and turned back toward the kitchen. There was a girl, silhouetted there, standing behind the bar. Ben stopped. He was sure she hadn't been there when he had come downstairs. Maybe a few of the residents had stayed in the house after all. "I didn't think anyone was here," Ben said, and his voice sounded hollow in the empty space. The girl didn't answer. He couldn't see her face at all, though he could tell her hair was long. He thought of his dream and wondered if this was the same girl from before, the one who had made tea and ignored him, the one that had later been consorting with the sinister blonde man on the sofa. Was he about to see his dream play out in real life now? His stomach clenched. "I stayed," the girl said, and Ben nearly jumped out of his skin. Her voice was soft and bell-like, with none of the sardonic edge that had categorized the voice of the kitchen girl. "I'm glad," Ben said, because her statement seemed to deserve an answer. "I thought I was in here all alone." "It isn't good to be alone," she said. She shifted her position a little, silently, and Ben thought he could see a glint of red across her ample tresses. Terrible things can happen. "Yeah, I guess they can." He still had not approached her, and now his heart was beginning to hammer. Was the blonde man about to come bursting through the front door to tear her limb from limb? But that was stupid. There were people all over the place outside. Someone would see him. Then another thought came to him. What if the man had snuck in with all the police officers? What if he was hiding somewhere in the house right now? "Look what happened to poor Jake." The girl lowered her head slightly, and Ben could have sworn he heard her chuckle. He dismissed the idea almost the moment he had thought it. "That was pretty horrible, all right." Ben strained to see her in the darkness, but he still couldn't make out her features. He gave up and began scanning the shadows around the room, wondering if someone else was watching them. He wished more than anything else that he'd turned the lights on when he'd first come downstairs. "Are you the only one left in here?" "Except for you," the girl said. And Ben could practically hear the predatory smile in her voice. His body temperature dropped several degrees. He had the sudden urge to sprint out the front door into the waiting arms of the straggling police and media, but for some reason he was frozen to the spot, just as he'd been in his dream. "Why did you stay?" Ben asked. The girl somehow seemed to have gotten closer to him, though she hadn't actually moved. "I can't leave. Why did you stay?" "Nowhere else to go." His throat was dry. Everything was suddenly very quiet, as though they were the only two people left on Earth. "That's too bad," the girl said. She tilted her head, and Ben caught that glimmer of red hair again. On some level he knew who she was, but he couldn't wrap his head around it, around how she could be here. "Do you know what those two boys called me?" It was on the tip of his tongue to ask what boys she was talking about, but he knew. He knew what she was going to say. He knew, and he was powerless to stop it. "Filthy cunt," they said. Her voice was mild, as though she was discussing the weather. Slut, whore, lots of other things. They didn't even know me. I had never done anything to them. Why do you suppose they did that? I don't know, Janice. They were terrible people. They're dead now. They paid for what they did. Did they? The girl stepped out from behind the bar. Her hair hung straight on either side of her face like curtains of blood, framing a perfect visage of vengeance. It wasn't enough. They didn't suffer enough. None of you have. Ben began to back toward the door, but somehow he couldn't find it. It didn't seem as though it was where it was supposed to be. Everything had taken on that surrealist aspect again, and he began to pray, fervently and silently, that this was a dream again, that it had all been a dream, everything that had happened from the moment he had arrived at this house. Janice, he said, his palms extended toward her. In his head played a continuous loop of, I can't believe I'm talking to a dead girl. You all have to pay eventually, she said with a strangely casual shrug. You just happen to be the only other man here right now, so you'll have to do. The last thing Ben remembered was Janice's face growing larger and larger in his vision, the way he had first seen her on the TV screen in Jake's room. She was smiling, and she looked almost angelic. Then he felt cold, iron-hard fingers close around his ankles, and then there was a tearing, wrenching sensation that began at his feet and continued upward until he was pierced by something huge that seemed to expand inside his abdomen. He had a moment of clarity where he managed a choked, gurgling scream, and then it cleaved him in two. Two men in a smoking room were talking of their private school days. At our school, said A, we had a ghost's footmark on the staircase. What was it like? Oh, very unconvincing. Just the shape of a shoe, with a square toe, if I remember right. The staircase was a stone one. I never heard any story about the thing. That seems odd when you come to think of it. Why didn't somebody invent one, I wonder? You never can tell with little boys. They have a mythology of their own. There's a subject for you, by the way, the folklore of private schools. Yes, the crop is rather scanty, though. I imagine if you were to investigate the cycle of ghost stories, for instance, which the boys at private schools tell each other, they would all turn out to be highly compressed versions of stories out of books. Nowadays, the Strand and Pearsons and so on would be extensively drawn upon. No doubt, they weren't born or thought of in my time. Let's see, I wonder if I can remember the staple ones that I was told. First, there was the house with a room in which a series of people insisted on passing a night, and each of them in the morning was found kneeling in a corner and had just time to say, I've seen it, and died. Wasn't that the house in Berkeley Square? I dare say it was. Then there was the man who heard a noise in the passage at night, opened his door, and saw someone crawling towards him on all fours with his eye hanging out on his cheek. There was besides, let me think, yes, the room where a man was found dead in bed with a horseshoe mark on his forehead, and the floor under the bed was covered with marks of horseshoes also. I don't know why. Also, there was the lady who, on locking her bedroom door in a strange house, heard a thin voice among the bed curtains say, now we're shut in for the night. None of those had any explanation or sequel. I wonder if they go on still, those stories. Oh, likely enough, with additions from the magazines, as I said. You never heard, did you, of a real ghost at a private school? I thought not. Nobody has that I ever came across. From the way in which you said that, I gather that you have. I really don't know, but this is what was in my mind. It happened at my private school 30-odd years ago, and I haven't any explanation of it. The school, I mean, was near London. It was established in a large and fairly old house, a great white building with very fine grounds about it. There were large cedars in the garden, as there are in so many of the older gardens in the Thames Valley, and ancient elms in the 3 or 4 fields which we used for our games. I think probably it was quite an attractive place, but boys seldom allow that their schools possess any tolerable features. I came to the school in a September, soon after the year 1870, and among the boys who arrived on the same day was one whom I took to, a Highland boy, whom I will call MacLeod. I needn't spend time in describing him. The main thing is that I got to know him very well. He was not an exceptional boy in any way, not particularly good at books or games, but he suited me. The school was a large one. There must have been from 120 to 130 boys there as a rule, and so a considerable staff of masters was required, and there were rather frequent changes among them. One term, perhaps it was my 3rd or 4th, a new master made his appearance. His name was Sampson. He was a tallish, stoutish, pale, black-bearded man. I think we liked him. He had traveled a good deal and had stories which amused us on our school walks, so that there was some competition among us to get within earshot of him. I remember, too, dear me, I've hardly thought of it since then, that he had a charm on his watch chain that attracted my attention one day, and he let me examine it. It was, I now suppose, a gold Byzantine coin. There was an effigy of some absurd emperor on one side. The other side had been worn practically smooth, and he had had cut on it, rather barbarously, his own initials, GWS, and a date, 24 July, 1865. Yes, I can see it now. He told me he had picked it up in Constantinople. It was about the size of a florin, perhaps rather smaller. Well, the first odd thing that happened was this. Samson was doing Latin grammar with us. One of his favorite methods, perhaps it is a rather good one, was to make us construct sentences out of our own heads to illustrate the rules he was trying to make us learn. Of course, that is a thing which gives a silly boy a chance of being impertinent. There are lots of school stories in which that happens, or anyhow there might be. But Samson was too good a disciplinarian for us to think of trying that on with him. Now, on this occasion, he was telling us how to express remembering in Latin, and he ordered us to each make a sentence bringing in the verb memini, I remember. Well, most of us made up some ordinary sentence, such as, I remember my father, or he remembers his book, or something equally uninteresting. And I dare say a good many put down memino librum meum, and so forth. But the boy I mentioned, MacLeod, was evidently thinking of something more elaborate than that. The rest of us wanted to have our sentences passed and get on to something else, so some kicked him under the desk, and I, who was next to him, poked him and whispered to him to look sharp. But he didn't seem to attend. I looked at his paper and saw that he had put down nothing at all. So I jogged him again harder than before and upbraided him sharply for keeping us all waiting. That did have some effect. He started and seemed to wake up, and then very quickly he scribbled about a couple of lines on his paper and showed it up with the rest. As it was the last, or nearly the last, to come in, and as Samson had a good deal to say to the boys who had written Meminismus Patri Meo and the rest of it, it turned out that the clock struck 12 before he had got to MacLeod, and MacLeod had to wait afterwards to have his sentence corrected. There was nothing much going on outside when I got out, so I waited for him to come. He came very slowly when he did arrive, and I guessed there had been some sort of trouble. Well, I said, what did you get? Oh, I don't know, said MacLeod, nothing much. But I think Samson's rather sick with me. Why, did you show him up some rot? No fear, he said. It was all right as far as I could see. It was like this. Memento, that's right enough for remember, and it takes a genitive. Memento, pute, inter, quator, taxos. What silly rot, I said. What made you shove that down? What does it mean? That's the funny part, said MacLeod. I'm not quite sure what it does mean. All I know is it just came into my head and I corked it down. I know what I think it means, because just before I wrote it down I had a sort of picture of it in my head. I believe it means remember the well among the four. What are those dark sort of trees that have the red berries on them? Mountain ashes, I suppose you mean. I never heard of them, said MacLeod. No, I'll tell you. Yews. Well, and what did Samson say? Why, he was jolly odd about it. When he read it he got up and went to the mantelpiece and stopped quite a long time without saying anything, with his back to me. And then he said, without turning round, and rather quiet, what do you suppose that means? I told him what I thought, only I couldn't remember the name of the silly tree, and then he wanted to know why I put it down, and I had to say something or other. And after that he left off talking about it, and asked me how long I'd been here, and where my people lived, and things like that. And then I came away, but he wasn't looking a bit well. I don't remember any more that was said by either of us about this. Next day, MacLeod took to his bed with a chill or something of the kind, and it was a week or more before he was in school again. And as much as a month went by without anything happening that was noticeable. Whether or not Mr. Samson was really startled, as MacLeod had thought, he didn't show it. I'm pretty sure, of course, now that there was something very curious in his past history, but I'm not going to pretend that we boys were sharp enough to guess any such thing. There was one other incident of the same kind as the last which I told you. Several times since that day we had had to make up examples in school to illustrate different rules, but there had never been any row except when we did them wrong. At last there came a day when we were going through those dismal things which people call conditional sentences, and we were told to make a conditional sentence expressing a future consequence. We did it, right or wrong, and showed up our bits of paper, and Samson began looking through them. All at once he got up, made some odd sort of noise in his throat, and rushed out by a door that was just by his desk. We sat there for a minute or two, and then, I suppose it was incorrect, but we went up, I and one or two of the others, and looked at the papers on his desk. Of course, I thought someone must have put down some nonsense or other, and Sampson had gone off to report him. All the same, I noticed that he hadn't taken any of the papers with him when he ran out. Well, the top paper on the desk was written in red ink, which no one used, and it wasn't in anyone's hand who was in the class. They all looked at it, McLeod and all, and took their dying oaths that it wasn't theirs. Then I thought of counting the bits of paper, and of this I made quite certain, that there were 17 bits of paper on the desk, and 16 boys in the form. Well, I bagged the extra paper and kept it, and I believe I have it now. And now you will want to know what was written on it. It was simple enough and harmless enough, I should have said. Si tu non veneris ad me, ego veniam ad te, which means, I suppose, if you don't come to me, I'll come to you. Could you show me the paper? Interrupted the listener. Yes, I could, but there's another odd thing about it. That same afternoon, I took it out of my locker. I know for certain it was the same bit, for I made a finger mark on it, and no single trace of writing of any kind was there on it. I kept it, as I said, and since that time I've tried various experiments to see whether sympathetic ink had been used, but absolutely without result. So much for that. After about half an hour, Sampson looked in again, said he had felt very unwell, and told us we might go. He came rather gingerly to his desk and gave just one look at the uppermost paper, and I suppose he thought he must have been dreaming. Anyhow, he asked no questions. That day was a half-holiday, and next day Sampson was in school again, much as usual. That night, the third and last incident in my story happened. We, McLeod and I, slept in a dormitory at right angles to the main building. Sampson slept in the main building on the first floor. There was a very bright full moon. At an hour which I can't tell exactly, but sometime between 1 and 2, I was woken up by somebody shaking me. It was McLeod, and a nice state of mind he seemed to be in. "Come," he said. "Come, there's a burglar getting in through Sampson's window." As soon as I could speak, I said, "Well, why not call out and wake everybody up?" No, he said, "I'm not sure who it is. Don't make a row. Come and look." Naturally, I came and looked, and naturally there was no one there. I was cross enough and should have called McLeod plenty of names. Only, I couldn't tell why. It seemed to me that there was something wrong, something that made me very glad I wasn't alone to face it. We were still at the window looking out, and as soon as I could, I asked him what he had heard or seen. "I didn't hear anything at all," he said, "but about 5 minutes before I woke you, I found myself looking out of this window here, and there was a man sitting or kneeling on Sampson's windowsill and looking in, and I thought he was beckoning." "What sort of man?" McLeod wriggled. "I don't know," he said, "but I can tell you one thing, he was beastly thin, and he looked as if he was wet all over. And," he said, looking round and whispering as if he hardly liked to hear himself, "I'm not at all sure that he was alive." We went on talking in whispers some time longer, and eventually crept back to bed. No one else in the room woke or stirred the whole time. I believe we did sleep a bit afterwards, but we were very cheap next day. And next day Mr. Sampson was gone, not to be found, and I believe no trace of him has ever come to light since. In thinking it over, one of the oddest things about it all has seemed to me to be the fact that neither McLeod nor I ever mentioned what we had seen to any third person whatsoever. Of course, no questions were asked on the subject, and if they had been, I'm inclined to believe that we could not have made any answer. We seemed unable to speak about it. "That is my story," said the narrator, "the only approach to a ghost story connected with a school that I know, but still, I think, an approach to such a thing." The sequel to this may perhaps be reckoned highly conventional, but a sequel there is, and so it must be produced. There had been more than one listener to the story, and in the latter part of that same year, or of the next, one such listener was staying at a country house in Ireland. One evening his host was turning over a drawer full of odds and ends in the smoking room. Suddenly he put his hand upon a little box. "Now," he said, "you know about old things, tell me what that is." My friend opened the little box and found in it a thin gold chain with an object attached to it. He glanced at the object and then took off his spectacles to examine it more narrowly. "What's the history of this?" he asked. "Odd enough," was the answer. "You know the yew thicket in the shrubbery? Well, a year or two back we were cleaning out the old well that used to be in the clearing here, and what do you suppose we found?" "Is it possible that you found a body?" said the visitor, with an odd feeling of nervousness. "We did that. But what's more, in every sense of the word, we found 2. "Good heavens, 2? Was there anything to show how they got there? Was this thing found with them? It was, amongst the rags of the clothes that were on one of the bodies. A bad business, whatever the story of it may have been. One body had the arms tight round the other. They must have been there 30 years or more, long enough before we came to this place. You may judge we filled the well up fast enough. Do you make anything of what's cut on that gold chain you have there?" "I think I can," said my friend, holding it to the light, but he read it without much difficulty. It seems to be GWS, 24 July, 1865.